All right, everyone. So picking up kind of where we left off on Tuesday's class, I want to kind of start with looking at where we see federalism in the Constitution. If you remember, we said federalism is the system of government where you have different layers of government or levels of government um, with overlapping responsibilities. And so we're going to talk about these images on the left, right? With the upper one being the layer cake model of federalism, and then the bottom one being the marble cake model of federalism. But before we get there, let's take a look in the U.S. Constitution. Where do you actually see federalism? Because we already said it's not stated. The word federalism is not there. But we see in the Constitution multiple parts where state and national governments, or national levels of government, have overlapping responsibilities. Number one, we see that states can establish courts, but so too can the national government, right? So Congress can expand the Supreme Court if they want to. Congress could create a new appellate court. Congress could get rid of a district court. So Congress, as a part of the national government, can establish courts, but so too can Colorado. Colorado can establish, state courts. If you want to go up in Denver, or you're looking at kind of the El Paso County like court, those are not federal courts, right? Those are state courts, and so both state and national government can establish courts, and that's an example of federalism. We also see it in that both state and national levels of government have responsibilities expressly stated in the Constitution for maintaining order, right? And I don't just mean like a national defense, right? But let's take national defense, right? What does every state have? Maybe I'll make that my first question here. What are in both state and federal government, how do each kind of collaborate to maintain order, or what is each's responsibility in maintaining order? And maybe just pause and answer that question. Okay, so if you said that states have national guards, right? There's the Colorado National Guard. There's the Colorado like state police, but so too does the federal government with the FBI and the ATF and the NSA and the Army, right? Or the Air Force. And so in the U.S. Constitution, we definitely see both state and national governments have roles to play there. Protecting citizens' health, um, number one, we see at the state level, right, where we have, kind of air regulators or public water utilities. Um, we see that states specifically kind of oftentimes oversee Medicaid funds. Um, but we also see that in the national government, right, with the Centers for Disease Control and the FDA, right, the Food and Drug Administration. And so there are multiple different like responsibilities, both at the state level and the national level, for maintaining health. That's federalism. Regulating financial institutions, right? Keeping an eye on banks or chartering banks is available to both. And then we see that both federal and state governments in the U.S. Constitution can both borrow money, can both raise revenue. They do this through taxes. It's the most commonly way that they can raise revenue. The federal government has federal taxes that you pay out of your paycheck, but so does the state, right? Those of you who've ever filed taxes or watched your parents file taxes, you pay both federal tax and state tax. And so they both have that responsibility expressly stated in the Constitution, and that would be an example of federalism. They both spend for the welfare of their citizens, right? They do this in a lot of different ways, from parks or mental health services, or you know, uh, local, not YMCA's, but local, like gyms or things like that. I'm really bad with examples right now. I don't know what's going on with my brain tonight. Usually examples pop right in my head. Uh, but the state government or a federal government does a lot too, right? We see Head Start programs. I mean, I could make this list a million things, right? Both the federal and the state governments spend to keep their citizens happy and healthy. And then they both have the power, and this is a vocab word here, although not in red, to affect eminent domain, which is a constitutional provision that is very controversial. But basically, it is in the Constitution and allows both federal and state governments to seize your property if it's determined that your property would be in the public interest to belong to somebody else. Now, the standards for this are pretty high. There's been a lot of court cases over the years that have kind of raised the bar of when they can claim eminent domain, but maybe the best example of this would be what happens if, you had a house somewhere out east of town, and Colorado Springs continues to grow over the next 20 years to the point where we really need to create kind of an interstate that goes around the city, kind of like what they have in Denver, right? Where back in the day, there was just I-25. But then they expanded it and said Denver's getting too big. We need to be able to go around Denver as well. So they made 225, right? And then, you have I-70, but then they made 470. And so let's say Colorado Springs continues growing for the next 20 years, and in 20 years, it's determined that we're too big a city to only have I-25 going through us, and there really needs to be a 225 that goes around Colorado Springs as well, maybe kind of east by Powers. And let's say you're a property owner out east of Powers, and your property happens to be right in the middle of where that interstate would really the only way it could run through. The state could, or the federal government, probably the federal government because the interstate system is managed by the federal government, but the state or the federal government could seize your property. They would have to pay you fair market value, but whether or not you wanted to sell, they could seize it and say, hey, we're taking your property. We know we offered to buy it from you for market value and you said no. So we're going to take it under our eminent domain powers because it's determined that the construction of this interstate is in the greatest interest of all residents of Colorado Springs. And so it's very controversial. Obviously, nobody likes getting their property or things taken by the federal government. And the standards are high, but they both have that ability to do it. And so now let's take a look at the question because we said, federalism is when national governments and state governments overlap and they share powers. And just like when you share things with your siblings or share things with your friends, right? There's going to be conflicts of like, hey, it's my turn, or you had it last, or, I want to do this. And so that same thing happens between the states and the federal government all the damn time. And so a lot of the case law that comes through kind of the district courts and appellate courts and ultimately the Supreme Court is determining what is exactly the boundaries of each. What can the states do? What can the federal government do? And how does this change as we progress as a society and new technology comes on board and we need to kind of settle these disputes. So let's look at how power disputes are settled between national and state governments. And so obviously, like I said, a lot of the court case law that comes through deals with this issue, right? And expressly, we're going to be looking in the coming days of Supreme Court cases that are Federalist cases, right? Federalism cases are cases that basically are deciding where are the limits of each government's power, the state government's and the federal government's power. And, essentially what all of these cases are trying to answer is this the responsibility of the state? Can the state do this? Or is this something the federal government could do? And so, one of the cases that you're going to look at, let's take US v. Lopez, was a case that came back in the 90s where, and you don't know what this is yet, we're going to talk about this, but basically, the federal government tried to pass a no guns in school zones law that you were not allowed to have guns. That basically the Second Amendment could be suspended within a school zone. You can't have open carry handguns on your belt. And so they passed a federal law that said you can't have a gun in a school zone. And the state sued. Not because they thought it was a terrible idea, but because they're like, by what power do you have the ability to make this law, right? Like that seems like it's our responsibility. And so in that court case, the federal government argued that they had the right to do this because they had the right to control and regulate interstate commerce. And they tried to make the argument that the regulation of guns in school zones has, an impact on local economies across the country, and so that allows them to use interstate commerce powers to regulate this. And states said, "What? That's a stretch, right? Like, how can you use the Commerce Act or the Commerce Clause to prevent guns in school zones?" And the Supreme Court ultimately said, "It's not that we think it's a terrible law, but we agree with the states. There is no provision in the Constitution that gives you the power to prevent guns in school zones. If states wanted to do that, they'd be well within their power, but the federal government can't." And so that case, US v. Lopez, is a clear federalism case that basically said to the federal government, bad, get back, back, right? You've gone too far. And the states, ultimately, their power increased as the federal government was checked. We see this a lot with environmental standards when the EPA tries to pass something like a Clean Water Bill or a Clean Air Act or things like that, and the states say, "Hey, dude, like that seems like a stretch." And so you see those cases come through a lot. You see, particularly with schools lately, since No Child Left Behind, the federal government has been increasingly involved in schools, and so states oftentimes sue and say, you don't have this power. This is our power. And so a lot of the cases in the courts are looking at these things. These are federal cases. Abortion, marriage, ultimately, um, the idea of gay marriage and the allowing of gay marriage was sort of a federalism case, right? It was basically found that when the federal government made a law that said the Defense of Marriage Act, that said a federal statute that marriage between a man and a woman was the only marriage allowed. And then the states went in, who also had the ability and the power under the Constitution to issue marriage license. Some states basically said, well, we're going to issue a marriage license to same-sex couples in like Vermont, for example, and Iowa, and a couple others. And so then basically people were getting married in New Hampshire and Vermont and basically suing the federal government that says, hey, New Hampshire and Vermont recognize my marriage. You do not. You're supposed to acknowledge, this that legal contracts made in certain states are valid in other states. And so it was a federalism case, right? That we're looking at the extent of power of different levels of government. And so, as a rule, federalism debates of whose power is it, right? Should it be a federally controlled entity or rule, or should this be a state controlled rule? That these federalism debates often end up in the courts. And oftentimes, the federal government will use something called the supremacy clause in order to argue that when state laws are in contradiction to federal laws, as long as the federal government is acting constitutionally, the federal government wins. That the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and therefore the federal government is going to trump state governments so long as the federal government is acting constitutionally, right? And so the supremacy clause is often used in these court cases to argue that the federal government gets to decide and that the states need to kind of watch themselves. But sometimes the courts will say, I'm sorry, federal government, you are not acting constitutionally, and so therefore your supremacy clause argument is not valid. Um, and so I wonder whether I'm confusing you a little bit too much in this in this lecture, but just trust that we're going to be exploring these court cases and these ideas over the coming days. And so we're going to do more on this on Friday to give you um, kind of specific examples to hang a lot of the theory that I'm talking about. Um, but the supremacy clause being a vocab word in this chapter, just maybe to go a little bit on it or a little bit deeper in it. The Supremacy Clause is a part of the Constitution that says that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And so, therefore, as long as the federal government is acting constitutionally, you can't, as a state, right, argue that Maryland state law should supersede federal law. The Supremacy Clause says, I'm sorry, but that's not true, right? Federal law will always win as long as that federal law is constitutional. That's the Supremacy Clause. Um, we also see that treaties are basically only allowed to be made by the national government. I'm trying to think about what I meant